Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. And just a reminder to please stay muted. We will have time for questions at the end. Thanks. This specific training is focused on our planning grant letter of interest. So we held 2 trainings in November about our loan letter of interest, and that recording for that training is posted online. So a couple of housekeeping items before we get started here. As I said, the training will be recorded. We will be emailing out a link to the recorded training to all registered attendees after the meeting for your reference. The slides, unfortunately, have not been made available yet, but we will send those out at the end of the meeting. We have muted all participants, so please remain muted. And please add your questions that pop up in your head throughout the training in the chat box. We will have LaDawn monitoring the chat box, so she will be answering some of the questions as we go and then saving some questions for discussion at the very end. So please feel free to add any questions you have to the chat box. So here is our agenda for today, December 7th. We will be going over a timeline of the overall letter of interest process and a little bit of background information. And then we'll be jumping into the drinking water planning grant letter of interest form. That is the form that we will be primarily reviewing and discussing today. And then we will briefly touch on the differences in the wastewater planning grant form. And then our main emphasis today is also to reserve time for questions and discussion at the very end. So again, feel free to write down your questions for discussion or put them in the chat box throughout today's training. So these are a few of the people that you're going to be hearing from today in DEQ's state office with the Drinking Water Protection and Finance Division, as well as the Technical Services Division. And all of these folks will introduce themselves. My name is Bonnie Record, and I'm a grants and loans analyst here working with the Drinking Water Protection and Finance Division. And now you will be hearing from Mariana Peavy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mariana Peavy, and I am the Grant and Loans Bureau Chief here at DEQ. And I'm just going to tell you just a little bit about our program. First of all, thank you for attending this training and learning a little bit more about the grant and loan program and our letter of interest program. So how you're going to be able to obtain money from our program. I do want to let you know that DEQ's grant and loan program was established over 30 years ago. And our goal is really to help meet the needs of Idaho's communities by providing grants and low interest loans for drinking water and wastewater infrastructure projects. Now, what makes up our program is that we get 2 EPA grants, one for drinking water and one for clean water, which is the same as wastewater. Now, in order, these grants, what we're supposed to be using them for is to provide low interest loans to drinking water and wastewater systems for their upgrades. Now, in order to get these loans, you do need to have an engineering report or facility plan and an environmental report. Now, that's where our planning grant program comes into play. We fund 50% of these reports, these costs, in order to get our loans. Now, I'm going to tell you just a little bit more about our loans and some funding options that we have over the next several years. Now, for our grants that we receive, usually we receive about $7 million for each of those grants. So $7 million for drinking water and $7 million for wastewater. And with these grants, the state also puts in 20% match. We lend this money out. It gets the money that we get paid back, we call it repayment dollars, goes back into the fund and we relend those out. Now, in the last few years, our loan production has been high and we've been using every penny that we have. And so we are excited to see some additional funding that will be coming through for both the grants and the loans for the next few years. In general, for our planning grants, we usually get about $350,000 a year to put towards each drinking water and $350,000 for wastewater. The funding for these planning grants actually come from those EPA grants. So for the drinking water grant that we receive, we take $350,000 of that and we put it towards the planning grants. On the wastewater side, some of our interest earnings that we receive from the loans that we give out, we take out $350,000 and we put it towards the planning effort. Usually with that $350,000, there are a lot of projects. We don't get to fund them all. And so we have put caps on our planning grants. Usually our caps would be about $65,000 on the wastewater side. So we pay up to 50% with a max of $65,000. And on the drinking water side, again, 50% with a max of $45,000. This past year, we waived that, and I'll kind of explain that a little bit more later. But with some of the additional funding that will be kind of coming through, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it, we don't anticipate those maxes being in play for our next fiscal year, which we're describing the letter of interest for fiscal year 2023. So we don't plan on having caps there. In future years, I'm not sure if we will, but I think with some of the funding that we have coming into play, I'm hoping that we won't have a max on either the drinking water or the wastewater ones for a few years. And the reason why I don't think there will be is that last month, President Biden signed a $1 trillion infrastructure bill. And we don't have all the final numbers yet, but what we're anticipating with this infrastructure bill is for the next 5 years, those annual grants, those annual appropriations that we get will more than double, and in some cases triple to quadruple. So for the clean water side, the grant amount that we're looking to get is $22 million a year for the next 5 years. This is up from $7 million that I had mentioned before. For the drinking water side, we're looking and believe the estimate is around $44 million a year for the next 5 years. And that is up again from $7 million. The drinking water side is a lot more, so I do believe we'll take a good portion of that and apply it to planning grants. So this is a great time to invest in your system, start the planning effort to move into a construction loan, since we're having a great amount of funding opportunity. Now, one item you see here on the slide is to talk about the American Rescue Plan Act. That is something else that is some possible funding for drinking water and wastewater infrastructure projects. To tell you just a little bit more background about the American Rescue Plan Act, or I will call it ARPA from now on, but the state was given $1.2 billion. Now, with this $1.2 billion, they were told they were either to use that money to respond to COVID health emergency or negative economic impacts from COVID. They were to provide premium pay to essential workers or provide grants to employers. Third, provide government services extensions due to lost revenue because of the pandemic. And the fourth item that they could spend the ARPA funds on is to make necessary investment in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. Now, the guidance that the U.S. Treasury put out in making those investments to water and sewer is that anything that qualifies under the SRF program, which is our grant and loan program, then it could qualify for ARPA funding. Now, the state has not decided how they're going to allocate all of that $1.2 billion, but we are anticipating that they're going to put a good portion of that funding to drinking water and wastewater projects. Now, I don't know exactly if they're going to be putting it through DEQ's program or how they're going to allocate it out. Here at DEQ, we're preparing for the fact that that funding will be coming through our program, since it does mirror the SRF program. But regardless, we do want to prepare everyone to get them the planning effort to move them into construction to tap into that funding, either to ARPA funding or to that infrastructure bill that I spoke about a little bit earlier. Now, I do want to let you know that we have received some ARPA funding for the planning effort. For our planning grant program, we received $2 million this fiscal year, so for fiscal year 2022. So everyone who was on our priority list for planning grants, both drinking water and wastewater, had access to that ARPA funding. And so we've allocated out some of that $2 million. Now, we still have about $700,000 left of that money that we're going to apply to the planning grants, or to people who will be applying or get on our priority list, excuse me, for the planning grants for 2023. But we still have money that we've received from the grants. So that will also carry over. And then for our additional allocation that we're getting, we're again going to take a portion of that and apply it to the planning grants. We really want to make sure we're funding as many planning projects as possible, so systems can move forward and tap into these additional dollars that are coming through for construction. So this is a great time for you guys to start the planning effort and get funding from us. And we really anticipate that we'll be able to fund a lot of the planning projects that apply for fiscal year 2023. All right, I'll go ahead and pass it on to Charlie, who will talk more about our priority list process.
And I'm actually just going to jump in real quick before Charlie and just share this timeline with you. So this is our state fiscal year 2023 letter of interest timeline for both grants and loans. So it's a good way to visualize the important dates throughout our process for this year. So we actually mailed out the letter of interest forms and made them available online for both the loans and the grants on October 22nd. November and December, we are having the online training events for how to fill out the letters of interest. And then the important due date here is January 14th, 2022. That is when all of the letter of interest forms are due to the state. And then after that, we go into our review and rating of the letters of interest for both the planning grants and the loans. In April, the intended use plans for loans, rating forms, and grants are posted for a 30-day public comment. And then in May of 2022, the Board of Environmental Quality will review and approve those plans. So then in June, notification letters will be sent, and finally funding will become available to applicants in July 1st, 2022. So that's a good summary of the major points, and just keep in mind that those letter of interest forms are due January 14th. And now we're going to have Charlie discuss a little bit more about priority lists.
Hello, everybody. I'm Charlie Parkins, the grant and loan coordinator for the program. I'm going to dive in a little bit deeper on the grant priority list. Bonnie provided kind of a 30,000-foot view, so I'm going to hone in just a little bit on how the priority list is developed. As Bonnie said, once we get all the LOIs, we rank them from severe issues all the way down to minor issues. If you sat in on the loan LOI training, you'll know that it's the same process with that, except for there's a couple items where systems can get skipped or jumped based on their readiness to proceed. The grants, however, don't really have that that stipulation. It's primarily based on severe issues all the way down to minor issues. The only way that we will really move down that priority list is if a system opts out and decides that they don't want funding, or if we have extra funds, we can move down the list. Once the draft priority list is developed, we send it around to all the regional engineers for additional review, just to make sure everything was rated fairly and equally across the state. From there, it is sent out for public comment that Bonnie had mentioned. It's a 30-day public comment period, so all the systems that submitted LOIs can review where they fell on that grant priority list. From there, it gets sent to the DEQ board. It's still a draft at that point. It doesn't become finalized until the DEQ board reviews it and can also add their input, and that usually happens around May. After the DEQ board approves it, then that's when the list becomes final. It is possible for things to move around, so you'll want to double check it. But we will send out letters of notification to all the systems that submitted letters of interest and notify you if you fell in that fundable range, or if unfortunately you fell in that unfundable range. As Mariana mentioned, we do have a lot of funds. So the good thing is we should be able to provide a lot of funding for grant priority or for grants. It is competitive. If we do run out of funds, we won't be able to fund the entire priority list. So keep that in mind when you're filling out those letters of interest. But again, once the DEQ board approves it, it becomes finalized, and then starting July 1st is when the fiscal year starts. And so that's typically when we start to see the applications come in and when the grant contracts get sent out and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of a deeper dive into how the grant priority list is developed. And so I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you, Charlie. So just to go over a little bit more on the rating criteria and the rating process, we do have our fiscal year 2023 rating forms for the planning grants and the loans posted, and those are for your reference. And LaDawn will link to those forms in the chat box for your review. So a bit of a timeline there is that as we said before, the letters of interest are due January 14th, and then from the end of January to the beginning of March 2022, we will basically have a review and collaboration ranking meetings between the state office staff, regional engineers from each region, as well as technical services engineers. And we fill out the rating forms as a group. It's a collaborative process, and there's quite a bit of discussion that goes on in those meetings. So we will then fill out the form and assign a point value to each letter of interest that we received. There are a couple of main focuses that our point values are focused on, and that includes focus on potential public health and environmental concerns, the long-term viability of the system, and also the status of the system's compliance with state and federal regulations. So we do have ranking criteria cited in the state statutes, and we are going to have Mike Stambulis go ahead and talk about that now.
Good morning, everybody. As Bonnie said, I'm Mike Stambulis. I'm a water quality engineer who works mostly with the drinking water and wastewater programs. I've also been helping the grant loan program review and rank letters of interest for about 7 years now. So as Bonnie mentioned, this slide is just pointing you to where the rules establish how we rank, how we can score and rank the applications. Each rule on this slide has a subsection titled Priority Rating System, which establishes the categories and points for both the grant and loan programs. So we create the questions on the letter of interest to follow these rules. And you'll note if you pull up the forms and follow along that each section has an introductory quote from the rule that also indicates what the maximum points are for each section. And as the next slide will show is just basically that LaDon has already posted the link in the chat to the forms. So if you wish to open them up and follow along, we'll go over the drinking water form in a little bit more detail for this training. We went over the wastewater loan form in the last trainings for the loan program. So trying to balance that out by giving a little deeper dive into the drinking water forms. So section 1 is just getting some background project information. And I did notice there was a question in the chat regarding if you needed to have a separate application for the ARPA funds. And what we've done for this year's forms is we added that very first question. If you are interested in receiving ARPA funding, would you like this project to be considered? That is to keep us from having to have systems reapply for that funding, and then it keeps us from having to re-rank everybody who would then have to reapply. So not knowing exactly how the funding timing will work out with the SRF process that we're going through at this point in time, we're using that question to sort folks and systems that might be interested in the ARPA funding as well. Other than that, then it's just a little background information so we know how to get in touch with you as we review the document. So this section B addresses project readiness, but as Charlie indicated, it's a little bit different from the loan process. Here we're just trying to get an idea of where you are in the planning process. Question 3, have you started discussing this with an engineer? Just gives us a little bit of background information to how accurate your cost estimates might be. The more you've talked with an engineer, the more firm your costs might be. And then at the bottom of this page, it talks about the environmental information document. Now, I think we've mentioned already that you must have an EID completed to proceed with a SRF loan with our with DEQ. Now, you don't necessarily have to do an EID as part of the grant process, but we do allow that to be funded with this grant money. So we're asking if you're going to include an EID and how much of your total planning budget would be used to cover that. And before we go deeper into the forms, LaDon's going to talk a little bit about that process.
All right, good morning. Good morning. So just to give you guys a brief overview of how the environmental review process works, once the facility plan is approved by our regional engineers, they will loop me or Bonnie into the process, and we will reach out to the system to put together a scoping meeting. And during that scoping meeting, we'll talk about the project and what kind of consultations may be needed, and if the project is likely to be a categorical exclusion or a finding of no significant impact or FONSI. So we'll discuss the different aspects of the project during that point. We'll talk about the public meeting requirements and next steps for the environmental review process. Once we have that meeting, then the system will usually have their public meeting, which is a 14-day notice of the different project alternatives, and then they will choose one of those. And those meeting notes are important to have in the facility plan or environmental document to show that this is the project you'll be moving forward with, and that's what we'll base our final environmental review on. The final environmental review documentation can be information added directly to the facility plan or a separate environmental document. That's discussed during the scoping meeting, what the system is going to want to do for that, and the engineers and so on. So we'll figure that out during the scoping meeting. That will be submitted. It usually takes us a couple of weeks for turnaround, depending on how many projects we have going on at that time. But we'll review that information, make sure it checks all of our boxes. There are some forms in our handbook that kind of outline what we're looking for. So you can take a look at those there in chapter 5. And then we'll issue a determination and a legal notice. And sometimes, depending on the paper of records timing, that can be what takes some of the longest time. If they don't post weekly, or if they only post once a week, can take some time to get that legal notice posted in the paper. But in general, the determination is needed if the system is going to be looking at DEQ for loan funding. So if you're going to want an SRF loan through our program, then you will need an environmental determination, and that can be done as part of the facility plan process and the grant process. Next. And then just to give you an idea of completed determinations over the last few years, most of our projects have been categorical exclusions, a couple of FONSIs. The big difference is that with the FONSIs, we have a few more consultations and a 30-day public comment period. So it takes a little bit longer, but really not much more than a CADX determination. And we can also issue determinations in concurrence with rural development, and we can review block grant information as well, and do a determination with those documents. So again, that all gets discussed during the scoping meeting.
Okay, folks, back to me and going over a little bit more information on the forms. So I'm not going to go into detail on every question. So if you have a specific question, please put it in the chat and I'll try and address it later. I'm more trying to provide some insight into the information we're looking for, so you can keep that in mind if you're filling out the form yourself, or if you're doing it in conjunction with an engineer that you've contracted. Also, just wanted to point out that there's a little bit of a difference of the overall level of information you could provide in the grant applications and the loan applications. You know, for a loan, you've already got a project identified, so you can give us a little more specific ideas on how you arrived at the project that you're proposing to get funded. For a facility plan and the associated grant, it's more that you have some known issues, or you think you have some issues, and your facility plan will identify those issues and ways to remedy them. So just a little bit of a different focus on that. So starting with section A here, this is the public health hazard section. And we're starting to assess what public health hazards exist within your system. So we start by asking about your violations. Every public drinking water system has to do routine monitoring. And this section will ask if you have any identified MCL violations. Please note though, when you're asking for points for these, we're looking for violations that are unresolved and that your planning document will look into solve. So you might have had an E. coli MCL violation, but you tested out of it or something along those lines. That's not, we're looking for something that's hasn't been resolved yet. Go on to the next section, or slide, I should say. So in addition to MCLs, there are other potentially serious issues that may fall under our definition of public health hazards. These next few questions, 2, 3, 4, and 5 start to get at that. Do you have frequent unresolved incidences of pressure that might be causing some depressurization in your system? If you're having a reduction in source capacity or some significant deficiencies, you know, those are all potentially serious issues that your facility plan could help identify solutions to. Number 5 is a new question that deals a lot with one of the main areas of focus now with EPA is the PFAS, PFOA, those types of contaminants that we are now supporting testing of and is now getting identified as significant issues. So those are what we're identifying as public health hazards. Of course, you might have some existing facility issues that your system may be facing and wish to address, but the conditions do not rise to the level of being deemed a public health hazard as described in that in the grant rules. So One important reminder here is that we treat each individual, we try and score each individual issue in either one or the other category. So if it rises to a public health hazard, we're not going to score it again in section B for the same issue. So in other words, we're trying not to double count in the different sections for each individual issue. But once again, by identifying issue, the underlying premise is that the facility plan will investigate ways to address this issue. So we start here with some treatment deficiencies. You don't meet the rules, but it's not causing an MCL violation. We can go on to the next slide, please. Once again, these questions are getting at the general conditions of your existing system. One thing I'd like to point out is when we discuss source capacity in question that looks like a 2B, we're not looking there. If you have a lack of redundancy, that's a separate question in number 4. I point that out because that's one of the most common things that we adjust when we do in the review of the letter of interest forms. So that's just basically your existing capacity cannot meet your demand. It doesn't address a lack of redundancy within the system. And so once again, just to emphasize with the facility plans, you might think you have some deficiencies and it's okay. We're a little more lenient on the scoring. You don't have to have a firm idea that your distribution facilities have inadequate capacity. You might think that, and your facility plan can investigate that and flush that out more for an upcoming loan project. So that's it for the specific information about the system. Then we move on to the green infrastructure efforts. I'm not the expert here. Nicholas, unfortunately, Nicholas Hebert is out sick today, so I'm covering for him. I won't be able to give as great of answers as Nicholas does, but generally a portion of our funding that's allocated to us has to be dedicated to these green infrastructure efforts. And we have a variety of categories here, from management issues, as this first section addresses, trying to encourage things that lead to long-term system sustainability, such as a capital improvement plan, such as a rate study to set acceptable or appropriate rates to make sure that you can fund necessary improvements to your system in the future. So this section 1 is, like I said, just items that we feel are important and worth identifying in your facility plan. Section 2 on the next slide and section 3 get more into green efforts and water conservation efforts. One of the big ones is installing meters. That is a very good way to limit the water or reduce the water consumption in your water system. I won't go through all these. We can go on to the next slide. Some common energy conservation efforts as well, variable frequency dot drives, energy efficient motors. Once again, just to emphasize, at the facility plan stage, when you select one of these boxes for the green infrastructures, doesn't mean you're committing to it for your loan project. It means you're going to evaluate it, or your engineer will evaluate it as you're producing the facility plan. They might provide a cost estimate, and then you can determine when you move to the loan if you're going to incorporate these items that you identified as investigating during the facility plan. And we have a link here at the end of the section, examples that have been accepted for Idaho projects, trying to help you out in identifying what green infrastructure projects or items might be appropriate for your project. So moving through that, then we are looking at consent order, compliance agreement schedules, court orders. I didn't mention it yet, but it's been kind of alluded to. One of our big goals of the SRF funding program is to solve and help people solve their largest issues, the biggest environmental issues, the biggest public health issues. So one surrogate of that is if you're in a consent order or you're under a compliance agreement schedule, you actually will get some bonus points for that if you're actively moving forward on that within those documents. But then we recognize that systems that are operating in accordance with our rules and taking steps that would lead to well-run systems, they deserve some bonus points too. So that's what this section is getting at. These items here are, as I said, items that lead to a well-run system, to hopefully lead to avoiding issues in the future. So we want to recognize that with some bonus points. And then one of the last sections is the affordability. So as the intro says here, points shall be given when current system user charges exceed state affordability guidelines. Now, that's about all I can really say on this section. I'm not sure if Mary Ann or anybody else wants to give a little bit more background information, but basically, well, I'll stop there because like I said, I'm not 100% sure that I can give accurate information on that.
On this area, there are opportunities for a little bit of bonus points for affordability on the drinking water side. So that's why we have this here.
Okay, thank you, Mariana. I appreciate that. That's basically the drinking water forms. The grant forms mirror the loan forms. The difference just being that the loan forms are for a specific project. The grant forms are evaluating your overall system status. I'm not going to go over the clean water planning grant forms in detail. For that, we have posted a link to the recordings from the previous trainings. The wastewater forms are, the grant and loan forms are very similar. Their focus is a little bit different. The wastewater forms focus on your impacts to waters of the state, to groundwater, so the impacts from the discharges from your system, whereas the drinking water forms focus more on the current status of your system. So just a little bit of a different focus on how we rate them. That follows with the rules that we pointed out back in the beginning of this section here. So if you have any questions or need any further detail, we do go over the grant or the loan forms, which mirror the grant forms in detail on those other trainings. And I think I get to turn it back over to LaDon, but I'm happy to answer any specific questions you have and if you just put them in the chat.
All right, thanks, Mike. So for this one, just a reminder that if you are submitting for a system, if you're an engineer submitting for a system or helping out a system, make sure you fill out this information at the end with the authorized submitter. And then just a reminder that the submittal deadline for LOIs for grants and loans is January 14th, 2022. So it's coming quickly. It's approaching very quickly. We've had a few submittals so far, and that's been great. So you could submit them earlier, but the deadline is January 14th, and those are to me. And if you have any questions about submitting, go ahead and reach out to me.
Thanks, LaDon. So I just wanted to share a few people's contact information. We have Charlie Parkins, who you heard from previously. He is the grants and loans coordinator. And also we have a grant and loan officer, Alicia, who will be around here in just a minute for the question period. So these are both two contacts for you as you prepare your grant letter of interest and general grant related inquiries. You can direct to Charlie and Alicia. And just wanted to list some regional office contacts per region. These are folks that could help you within the DEQ regional offices. So at this time, we are going to go ahead and go over questions. LaDon will be reading questions from the chat box and directing them to various members of our team for answering. And then towards the end, after those questions from the chat box are discussed, we will open it up for live questions that you can ask and unmute yourself. So we will start with the chat box, and LaDawn will start.
Thanks, Bonnie. And if you have any questions that you thought of, go ahead and add them to the chat box now, and we'll get to them pretty quickly. And just a reminder, we will send out the slides from this presentation after we're done here today. So the first few questions are for Mariana. With new funding, might the 50% match be reduced?
Good question. It's actually written in our rules, our DAPA rules, that we can only give out a max of 50%. So that's not something that we can adjust. However, one thing I want to highlight is any costs that the systems put in for this planning effort is also loan eligible. So the portion that we cover from the grant is great. Everything else that is out of pocket that the system puts in is loan eligible. So you can wrap it in to your loan. And with those loans, there are opportunities where we can, especially for small or disadvantaged communities, be able to provide principal forgiveness. So some of that principal forgiveness with our increase for the infrastructure bill, we do have a minimum principal forgiveness requirement with those grants. So for the next 5 years, what I'm anticipating annually, we do have to give out around $7 million in principal forgiveness on the clean water side. And on the drinking water side, we're required to give out around $10 million in principal forgiveness. So there are ways when you move into the loan side to recoup some of those dollars that you put in for the planning effort. Even though the planning grants itself were only able to fund 50%. Definitely keep in mind that that's not including how the state is going to want us to apply ARPA funding and and maybe some of it's going to be all principal or forgiveness essentially. And if it is, again, you can incorporate those costs that you put in the planning effort.
Great, thanks, Mariana. And then Mike kind of answered this one, but we'll do it again just to reiterate. So Mariana, are applications for the ARPA funds separate from normal wastewater drinking water funds, or will ARPA funds be combined with normal loan funds?
Yes, for simplicity and also staffing purposes, we are going to make it all at one. We want it to be easy for you guys just to mark, yes, you want to be considered for ARPA funding. And then whatever directive, if we get ARPA money, the directive received from the state on how they want us to allocate it, what we plan to do is either, if they want us to apply it to the priority list, we'll do that. Or if they want us to direct the funds specifically to certain types of projects, then we'll just pull those projects off of the priority list and fund it with ARPA dollars. So we're trying to be flexible and prepare for a lot of different scenarios.
All right, so along those same lines, Mariana, we just had a question. Do we have a sense of the state's timeline for ARPA funding allocation decisions?
They do need to do it fairly quickly. I'm anticipating, I know the governor, I believe, is planning to put it into his budget for this legislation. And then, of course, the legislators will finalize that budget and decide how much of the ARPA funding will go to drinking water and wastewater projects and to what agencies. Now, so I do expect to have some type of decision made during this legislative session. With the ARPA funding, there are deadlines on expending that money out. The funds need to be obligated by, I might have these dates mixed up, but I'll send out a clarification, but I believe obligated by the December of 2024 and expended by December of 2026. So there is a quick turnaround time with ARPA funding. And if the funding comes through DEQ, our plan is really to look at projects that are ready to go and to spend that money out as quickly as possible, not only obligate it, but what projects can be completed by December of 2026.
Thanks, Mariana. And then the last question I have from the chat box is there a December deadline? And I can't think of a December deadline that we have for the LOIs, but maybe I'm not thinking of all of them. No December deadlines, just the January 14th for turning in and submitting the grant and loan LOIs. Okay, so then we do have another question in the chat. Have we received a good number of responses on the survey that went out in partnership with IRWA and BSU? How will you use that information to inform funding?
Okay, I'll go ahead and speak on this. I know, LaDonna, you know this too, but no, we haven't received a great response to that survey, unfortunately. I believe we have around 1,900 drinking water systems and a little over 500 wastewater systems. And we've only received, I think, 190 responses to that survey. So very small percentage of all the systems throughout the state. So whatever we receive, we'll give out to the state legislators to help them decide what, the dollar amounts they will put to drinking water and wastewater systems. The other option I have besides just those surveys is what's been submitted for letter of interest. That's definitely another way I can show the demand in the state and hopefully give the state legislators some perspective of the need in Idaho.
Is it too late to do the survey? I can answer that question. It is not. It is open until December 10th. So there's still 3 more days to complete the survey. That was my last question in the chat box.
Okay, so if there are any other questions that people would like to just say out loud, go ahead and unmute yourself and we'll hang around here for a few minutes and see if anyone has questions. And otherwise, we will be eventually posting this recording and sending out the link as well as posting slides from this training. So thank you for attending and go ahead and ask any questions you have by unmuting.
Hi, everyone. This is Jeremy with RCAC. I was just wondering, with this slide deck that you're sending out, are you going to send it via email or are you going to post it? Because I know a few communities that I'd like to share this with.
We will post it on the events page for the calendar event for this. And then we can also send it out as well. We can do both.
Marianne, I thought I heard you say that an entity's 50% portion of their planning grant could later be rolled into a loan application. Can you talk a little more about that? Is that something that they pay the 50% up front and then get reimbursed through the loan for that? Or how exactly does that work?
Sure. When you do the planning grant, obviously you give us the total amount of what you expect the planning cost will be. You will then submit, during the planning process, you'll submit reimbursement requests showing the invoice of the amounts that the system get charged. And then we will pay 50% of that invoice. Now, after the planning grant's done and say you move to the loan, what you can do is request that the portion that you guys paid out of pocket gets rolled into the loan as well. So let's say the planning effort was 100,000, the planning grant paid 50, but the system paid 50,000 out of pocket. to kind of flush the cash back, you can go, we want that 50,000 to also be incorporated into the loan. And then we can essentially reimburse the 50% that the system paid out of pocket for the planning effort. You know, generally any cost that really was applied to the system or the system incurred to get the loan.
Okay,
Does that
that
help?
yeah, it does. And so then I guess if there was an application that was going in for a construction loan following a planning grant, that match amount would need to be added into the dollar total on that LOI to make sure that it's covered. And I guess then, does that need to be broken out separately on the loan LOI, or just rolled into the total and then broken out later once it's approved?
I would just put it in the total, and we'll break it out later during the loan application stage.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, with that, we will be sending out the recording and the slides, as well as posting those slides. And feel free to contact us with any other questions you have. Thank you so much for joining today. And please remember that the LOIs are due January 14th. Thank you.